Hello and welcome to this lecture for Introduction to Philosophy, and today we're going to talk about Plato's Republic, Book 2. Okay, so we notice a change here from the first chapter where we had a number of interlocutors, including Socrates, who has a lot to say. And we remember we had Polemachus, we had Cephalus, and we had the sophist Thrasymachus. And here we have a striking change. So now it's Plato, it's Plato's brothers here who are in the scene, Glaucon and Eudaimatus, and they are in argument with Socrates, who we know is Plato's teacher. So this is a different kind of dialogue here, and we notice straight away it's less antagonistic than chapter 1. Certainly in terms of Thrasymachus, there's no kind of conflict here in the same sense. And here we have a situation where Socrates is talking to two kind of well-born aristocratic young men, Plato's brothers. And the question here is, are they going to be persuaded by philosophy? Are they going to be persuaded by the philosopher? Or are they going to be persuaded by what will emerge as the alternative to philosophy, which is the sophist, and the idea of a different understanding of expertise and a different understanding of the public role of that expertise. So we'll get a better understanding of those issues as we go through. Certainly for Plato at this time, it seems that in writing this book, The Republic, Plato is kind of shifting towards a more kind of educative strategy here. There's Socrates in argument with two young men, and that will be the course of the rest of the book as a whole. Largely will sort of reflect this pattern, so it's more cooperative. It's Socrates being a teacher. And so this is sort of a more sort of collaborative type of arrangement. But of course, it's interesting the way it conflicts with the very different kind of agonistic or even antagonistic relationships of the first book that we saw, which tended to have to apply and to use a different kind of rhetorical strategy. Okay, let's take it from this episode at the beginning of book 2. And again, we see the setup and how this continues from book 2. And then we'll come to the first set of distinctions that Socrates makes in this second book to set up the main argument here, which is Gyges' ring. So right at the beginning of the chapter, we have Socrates saying, "Now when I had said this, I thought I was freed from argument, but after all, as it seems, it was only a prelude. For Glaucon, who is the most courageous in everything, and so now he didn't accept Thrasymachus' giving up, but said, 'Socrates, do you want to seem to have persuaded us, or truly to persuade us, that it is in every way better to be just than unjust?'" So we have here clearly signaled at the beginning that what Glaucon's doing is he's taking up Thrasymachus' argument here in the second book. He doesn't believe that the argument of the first book was convincing, and he's saying to Socrates, look, I don't think Thrasymachus gave up. Thrasymachus should have given up there. There's more that we need to say. I'm going to restate the argument, Socrates, and you've got to try and persuade me that it's better to be just than unjust. So Glaucon's going to play devil's advocate. He's going to restate Thrasymachus' arguments, and he's going to restate it in kind of enlightening ways, as we'll see. So he's taken on that role, and we'll see his brother Eudaimatus also takes on that same role, and they sort of work together to sort of draw out this picture that Socrates is going to portray about justice, which, like we said, is now going to be the central occupation of the book as a whole. So Socrates says, I would choose to persuade you truly if it were up to me. And then Glaucon continues in the next paragraph. Tell me, he says, is there in your opinion a kind of good that we would choose to have, not because we desire its consequences, but because we delight in it for its own sake, such as enjoyment and all the pleasures which are harmless and leave no after effects other than enjoyment in having them? So that's going to be our first category here of things that we desire for their own sake. And then he says, is there a kind of good we like both for its own sake and for what comes out of it, such as thinking and seeing and being healthy? In other words, something that is good in itself, good for its own sake, but also good for its consequences. And then he says, and do you see a third form of good, which includes gymnastic exercise, medical treatment when sick, as well as the practice of medicine? And these are things which are good, according to Glaucon, only for what comes out of them. So that's going to be our third category of good. So this is the first stage in the argument that he's going to put to Socrates to defend Thrasymachus's argument. So these are the three categories that Glaucon defines in this passage. We have things that are good for their own sake, right? Something that's good for its own sake is something we do for its own reward. Exercise is often thought as something that falls into that category. It can be something like running, maybe it's playing a sport, whether it's soccer or basketball or whatever. But often we don't do those things because of their benefits. We do them because they are beneficial for their own sake. Right, so there's something good in itself about exercise. There's something good in itself about playing sport. There's something good in itself about reading a book. There's something good in itself about gardening. We do all those things for their intrinsic pleasures, for the things that make them worthwhile. Right, not what comes out of them, but because it's intrinsically rewarding to do them, and we get benefits just by doing them. Playing music for a lot of people is like that. Playing an instrument, they don't do it to earn money, they just do it because it's enjoyable in itself, right? So everybody should have some categories of things that they enjoy doing for their own sake. It's part of what makes a good human life. So that's going to be an important category. The second category that Glaucon distinguishes are things that are good for their own sake and for their consequences. Right? So it may be that you enjoy sport for its own sake. If you're a professional athlete, you also get the added benefit of being paid for doing what you enjoy. Something is good for its own sake and for the consequences, i.e. you get paid for doing it. Right? So something where the consequences are also good. And of course, we can think of exercise in this category as well. Something that's intrinsically enjoyable. It's good to do it. You feel better doing it. But of course, you also do it for the consequences. It keeps you healthy. It makes your heart healthy. It sort of helps you, stay in shape. So there are good consequences as well that come out of doing it. So it's good for its own sake and for the consequences that stem from doing it. So again, I think we can think of a lot of things in that category, something that is good for its own sake, but also we get sort of beneficial consequences from it. Some people might enjoy, again, cooking, but of course there's also beneficial consequences. We get to eat what we cook. So a lot of things are like that, enjoyable for their own sake, but also for their consequences. And the third category, things that are solely good for their consequences, but not intrinsically pleasant. Taking our medicine, of course, is one of these things. When you go for a flu shot, it's not intrinsically pleasant. We don't do it because we like it. But of course, the consequences, being protected from disease, are very beneficial, and those consequences are ones we want. And again, we can argue about where things fit on these categories. Education, I would argue, fits in category number 2. It's good for its own sake and for its consequences. In other words, education develops us as people, as individuals, But of course, education also has sort of social rewards and consequences that go with it. Maybe that means a higher paying job. Maybe that means more prestige. Maybe that means an ability to work at a higher level, or to work at sort of higher rungs in an organization. So all of these consequences are good, but education, I would argue, is also good for its own sake. It's intrinsically rewarding, even if you didn't get the good consequences, right? So these three categories are very important for understanding the argument Glaucon's going to make. Now, Socrates says, when he's sort of pushed by Glaucon, that he believes justice belongs to the group of things that are good for their own sake. In other words, justice is good for its own sake, even if we don't get any good consequences from it, and for the sake of their consequences, right? So justice is good for its own sake and for its consequences. Excuse me, and those consequences are going to be things like reputation, right? If you're just and honest, you have a just and honest reputation, and that means people trust you. They're more likely to want to include you, to do business with you, and all those kinds of things. So justice, we might say it's good in itself, but also good for its consequences, as Socrates does, and we'll go into that further as we proceed. Now, Glaucon, however, responds by saying, well, popular opinion says that it belongs to group 3. And that means that popular opinion, he's talking, the opinion in Athens during the democracy. Popular opinion has a very low opinion of justice, if that's true, right? Because what it's saying is that justice is not good for its own sake, it's just good for its consequences. In other words, it's like medicine. We don't want to take it, we don't want to be just, but we do it because there would be bad consequences if we didn't, right? If we were unjust, there would be bad consequences in terms of people wouldn't like us, they would want to take revenge, they would want to get their own back, they would want to punish us. But we want to avoid that, so we want to be just to avoid that. So that's the group 3 thing. So popular opinion has this very low opinion of justice. It's only valuable for its consequences, but if we could get away with it and still get the consequences, yes, we would do that. That's the popular opinion view. Now, Glaucon demands he heightens the stakes for Socrates insofar as he says that he wants Socrates to prove that it's good solely for its own sake, right? He knows Socrates believes that it's good for its own sake and its consequences, but he says, look, if you're really going to make this work, Socrates, I want you to prove that it's good solely for its own sake, even if you don't get the good consequences. That's what I want to hear about justice. Right? And that means that Socrates has to show that even when the consequences are not good, even say if the consequences of justice were awful, it's still good in itself to choose justice, and that's what we should do. That's the argument he wants from Socrates. All right, so let's take up this popular opinion view, right? Glaucon's view. And not Glaucon's view, but it is Glaucon's view, but he's attributing it to the populace. He's saying this is what popular opinion says. They have this low opinion of justice, and it's essentially this view of justice as a second best, right? So it's this idea that justice is not really natural to humans, right? Justice and morality, we don't do them because they're good for us. We do them because we're forced to do it, right? So they're not natural, they're not part of our physis, right? That Greek word for nature. And remember, for the Greeks, physis, nature, is essentially a form of growth. It's not static, it's not just inert material. It's the way things grow into the form that they're supposed to be. So we could say that justice and morality are part of the ways in which humans grow into the form that they're supposed to be. This is the opposite of this popular opinion view in which justice is a second best, So for this view, justice is not natural, it's not part of our physis. Each of us wants to do injustice and get away with it, while everyone else is unable to do unjust things to us, right? In other words, that's what we want. We want to be able to do unjust things to others. We want to act on our self-interest and get the better of everybody else, right? Notice this is sounding very much like Thrasymachus's position, while everybody else is unable to do unjust things to us. Of course, that's the position of the tyrant that Thrasymachus proposes as the perfectly unjust or the perfectly just person, according to his definition, the one who has all the advantages, right? So the summit of this idea, this sort of very diminished idea and very negative idea of justice, the summit of this idea is to be the person who can do all the injustices they want to do and get away with it, while everybody else is unable to do the unjust things they want to do to us, right? So you have perfect power, everybody else doesn't, so you can impose your version of justice and get away with whatever you want, right? So that's the Thrasymachus view, that's the tyrant. And we'll come full circle to that position again right at the end when we've finished the Republic. So, according to this view, again, this is the popular opinion view, justice is a second best. We agree to set up, in other words, all of us together as a society, we agree to set up justice as a convention, right? That's nomos, the realm of convention or law, in order to force everyone else to be just, right? So we don't want everybody, we don't want everybody to be able to do unjust things to us and get away with it. So we have to settle for justice. And we settle for justice as a second best, not because it's good for us, not because it's natural to us, not because it's personal growth and development and education, but because we can't get away with doing unjust things, right? So that's the very sort of diminished and negative idea of justice that Glaucon is proposing when he sort of takes this up and says this is the popular opinion, that this is what justice is like, right? And he really wants Socrates to show why this view is wrong, right? He wants Socrates to take this view seriously, but show what goes wrong and show and prove why justice is the best for humans. And this is really the core of this book. The core of the Republic is the struggle for the souls of these young people who are persuaded by the sophists, right? Maybe they're going to be persuaded by this cynicism and this negativism about justice, or are they going to be persuaded by philosophy and Socrates' view about justice when he responds to Glaucon and tries to show that it's natural and it's about personal growth and development, right? So this is where the argument is. These young people, they want to be persuaded, but they're not going to be persuaded unless it's convincing, unless Socrates can really show them that thinking the naturalness of justice is superior. Okay, so now we get to the centerpiece of Glaucon's argument to Socrates, and we find it in the challenge of Gyges' ring. And here's how Glaucon introduces or sort of sums up what that challenge says, and he sort of is here introducing the story. And he says on page 37 that even those who practice it, and it here is justice, that even those who practice justice do so unwillingly from an incapacity to do injustice, we would best perceive if we should in thought do something like this. Give each, the just man and the unjust, license to do whatever he wants, while we follow and watch where his desire will lead each. We would catch the just man red-handed going the same way as the unjust man, out of a desire to get the better. This is what any nature naturally pursues as good, while it is law, which by force perverts it to honor equality. Law here is nomos, right? So it's nomos, not nature, which makes us honor equality and which makes us honor justice, right? So the license of which I speak would best be realized if they should come into possession of the sort of power that it is said the ancestor of Gyges, the Lydian, once got. They say he was a shepherd toiling in the service of the man who was then ruling Lydia. Right? So in the story, Gyges gets this ring, puts it on, he turns the collet, and it makes him invisible. And of course, with this power of invisibility, he can kill the king, marry his wife, and become very, very rich by using this deceit of invisibility. Right? So the challenge of Gyges' ring, this is Glaucon's challenge to Socrates. Glaucon is saying, and here he takes himself to be following public opinion, right? This is the opinion of the masses, that if you give the just man and the unjust man the same opportunity, they would do the same thing, right? Both of them would use the ring to increase their power. Both of them would do unjust things to increase their power if they had this power, right? So Glaucon is saying people are only just because they don't have the power to do injustice. If they had that power, they would act in the service of their own interests. They would be unjust towards others, and this is what they would do. And again, this is a restatement of Thrasymachus's argument, right? It's the powerful that get to determine what justice is. It's the powerful who get to decide, right? It's the powerful who don't have to play by the rules. In fact, they can make the rules and make everybody else adhere to the rules while they get to break them. So for Thrasymachus, it's about this difference between the powerful and everybody else, right? And so once Gyges gets this power, he's able to be unjust and get away with it. And Glaucon is saying, well, we would all do that if we had the power. The reason we don't is because we don't possess that power. But in essence, the person who is just and the person who is unjust are the same. They have the same human nature that wants to go against justice. What they differ in is simply power. So that's the challenge to Socrates. Now, as part of this argument, the next stage is to pull apart the ideas of justice as reward and reputation and justice for its own sake, right? And these are the two parts of something being good for its own sake and something being good for its consequences, right? Reward and reputation are like the consequences you get for being just. People believe you, people want to associate with you, people want to do business with you, people trust you, right? Those are rewards for justice. Now, both Glaucon and Edeematus is going to make this argument too, are going to argue for this pulling apart and say they want Socrates to justify the argument that the just man is happy and that it's superior and better to be the just person even when you are deprived of all the consequences, all of the rewards and reputations that follow from justice. So what this argument is about is the difference between being versus seeming, truth versus appearance, right? If you're perfectly just, in other words, you're just for its own sake, but you have the appearance of injustice, right? So the good man must be stripped of everything except justice, right? You're just for its own sake, you do good things, but you don't have the reputation and the reward. In fact, they're going to go on to say that has to be almost reversed, so that the just person is going to have the reputation for injustice, and it's the unjust person who will have the reputation for being just, right? And Glaucon says, I want you, Socrates, to prove to me in those circumstances that it's still better to be the just person, and that the just person is the person who is truly happy, even though they're suffering all these unjust consequences, even though they're suffering this unjust bad reputation. Prove to me that that person is still the happier, even though they've been stripped of everything except justice. So, and Socrates' response to this is kind of funny. He says, well, you've polished up these two statues, Glaucon, for us to look at and admire. So we've got the statue of the unjust man who appears perfectly just. We've got the just man who appears perfectly unjust. And Socrates is given the task of proving that the just person who appears unjust is actually the happier of the two, right? Even though the unjust person has all the social rewards that usually go with justice, has all the power, that person, because they're not just for its own sake, that person we're going to have to say is not as happy as the good person who is stripped of everything. That's the extent of the challenge that Socrates is going to have to answer. So Eudaimatus sums that up here on page 42. For the things said indicate that there is no advantage in my being just if I don't also seem to be, right? Being and seeming here, pulled apart, while the labours and penalties involved are evident. But if I'm unjust but have provided myself with a reputation for justice, a divine life is promised, right? So that's the opposition, that we're is there an advantage in being just when there are only labours and penalties involved and not good reputation? That's what Socrates has to prove. Now, Socrates sets out from this point in Book 2 onwards, sets out to answer this question. But there's a really important shift in the dialogue that happens on page 45, and it concerns this moment where we get an analogy between the city and the soul, or the city and the individual person. So here's what Socrates says. Right, so remember we've just set out to, Socrates has to sort of find the just person and prove that that person is happier than the unjust person with all the rewards, right? And at this point, this is what Socrates says. It looks to me as though the investigation we are undertaking is no ordinary thing, but one for a man who sees sharply. Since we're not clever men, I said, in my opinion, we should make this kind of investigation of it. If someone had, for example, ordered men who don't see very sharply to read little letters from afar, and then someone had the thought that the same letters are somewhere else also, but bigger and in a bigger place, I suppose it would look like a godsend to be able to consider the littler ones after having read these first, if of course they do happen to be the same. Most certainly, said Eudaimatus, but Socrates, what do you notice in the investigation of the just that's like this? I'll tell you, I said. There is, we say, justice of one man, and there is surely justice of a whole city too. Certainly, he said, is a city bigger than one man? Yes, it is bigger, he said. So then perhaps there would be more justice in the bigger, and it would be easier to observe closely. If you want, first we'll investigate what justice is like in cities, then we'll also go on to consider it in individuals, considering the likeness of the bigger and the idea of the littler. All right, so it's kind of set up here like it's almost a reading exercise, right? That we can see the letters bigger here, so let's look here and they're the same, so then we can just shrink it down, right? So the analogy here is between the city and the soul. And Socrates says, well, yes, we talk about individuals and justice and individual people being just, but we also talk about the city as being just. Remember, the city is the state, it's the sort of political form at this time. So we think of a state or a city as being just as well. So Socrates is basically saying, well, as this is bigger, why not look there? And then we can sort of think of the justice as individuals when we've seen what happens in the justice of cities, right? So from this point forward, what's going to happen is they're going to set out to construct the perfectly just city, what they're going to call the city in speech, right? Now, at some point, we're going to have to deal with the repercussions that come out of this analogy, right? And it's introduced here on page 45, as we can see. And Socrates says, let's look at the city because it's bigger, right? Well, that may be true, but there may be some things that, there may be some problems caused, let's say, by taking this strategy of looking for justice in the city and then looking for it in the individual. Now, I think Plato, when he writes this, is aware of what these problems are. And he's doing this for a reason, to show us what happens when we look at the city and the individual together. And we'll see some interesting things start to happen, some interesting questions arise, right? Plato's aware of what the differences are. I think he's aware of the problems that emerge, but those problems tell us and show us some interesting things, some vitally interesting things about justice, as we'll see. But we have to bear this analogy in mind, right? We're looking at the city and we're investigating a perfectly just city. But the reason we're doing this is because we're looking for the individual, and we're trying to answer that challenge of proving that the individual who is just and just for its own sake, that individual is happier than the individual who is unjust and immoral, right? So that's what we're looking for. Now, of course, there may be some other sort of grounds to do this. It may be that we can't think of the just individual in isolation, and we have to think of them in relation to the just city, right? And that may be the claim here, right? It may be that we're saying, well, a single just person can't really exist on their own. They're going to be persecuted if they're not in a sort of just city and community. So we need to think at the communal level. But of course, doing that is interesting too, because it might show us some things about what happens when we think about justice at the level of the community and the level of the city that would be vastly different from when we think about it at the level of the individual. Or looking at it at this level throws up problems that we're going to have to deal with when we think about it at the level of the individual. So this analogy is highly significant, and it's going to cause us a lot of problems as we go through, but those problems are good ones because they're going to enable us to work through some really significant philosophical issues that emerge when we think about justice. Okay, so the sort of order and arrangement and organization we end up with at the end of chapter 4 looks something like this, where we've sort of distinguished the parts of the city that emerged at the end of book 3. We've got the rulers who are called the true guardians at the end of book 3, and they're distinguished from the auxiliaries, who are now the kind of warrior class, or the sort of military class of sort of protective, the sort of protective work of protecting the city and making sure order is established and maintained. And then everybody else, the common folk, the producers, the farmers and craftsmen at the bottom, who either farm the land or produce commodities for sale. So that's the three-part order of the just city, and it's a kind of tri-functional arrangement that Plato sets up. Before the modern era, there are a lot of examples of sort of tri-functional societies that were gradually overcome and transitioned into more modern societies. But typically in these societies, there was one class that was dedicated towards meaning, and that was usually the clergy. There was another class, the nobles, who were sort of dedicated towards protection, and the mass of people were the kind of third class. So Plato's own sort of perfect city, the just city, is a kind of tri-functional order like those, where of course it's the auxiliaries here. There's a warrior class similar to a lot of tri-functional societies, and instead of the clergy, which of course is more typical in kind of nominally Christian tri-functional societies, what we have here are rulers who know the good, as we'll see, and those are that's the class of people who will be the rulers of the sort of rulers. They would sort of decide on the sort of meanings that matter for the just city and the goals and all of that kind of thing. So in this chapter we'll see the virtues, and we'll see how they relate to the parts of the city, and we'll also distinguish the parts of the soul as well. And these two things, as we'll see, are really fundamental for Socrates' response to Glaucon and the challenge of Gyges' ring, and we'll see a kind of response emerging through the virtues and the parts of the soul and the importance of the soul. We'll see that answer emerging at the end of book 4. So part of the task here is to kind of remember we went from the sort of city, that we went from thinking about justice to thinking about the city, because Socrates told us that the letters are bigger and it's easier to see. But we were promised that at some point we would sort of shrink that down and go back from the parts of the city to the sort of individual and the parts of the soul. So back from the community to the individual, and we'll see that happen in book 4. All right, so let's sort of fill in a little bit before we finish Plato's answer to Glaucon and the challenge of Gyges' ring, which was the challenge set out in part 2. And we've just seen how Plato's idea of the soul gives a kind of answer to that question. And there's a number of parts that we can sort of look here, a number of claims that are important to really understand what this claim means and what this response means. So it's clear that for Socrates here in the case that he's laying out, being moral, being just, is a commitment to live a certain kind of life, to be a certain kind of person. Right? And that's a person who is ruled by reason, who looks out for their long-term good, etc. And that being that kind of person allows us to flourish as human beings. We've seen Socrates argue this is what's according to human nature. This is how we're supposed to flourish as people if we keep this natural order of the soul that's reflected in the functional order of the good city, living the kind of life and achieving the kind of goods that represent a life lived well according to human nature. Right? So only if we sort of live in this way, that if we order our souls in this way, letting reason take charge, keeping desire in check, that's the only way we can have the kind of life according to nature that enables us to flourish, right? So the response to Thrasymachus and the sort of the Gyges ring view, which Glaucon puts forward at the beginning of chapter 2, is that self-interest or pleasure is far too narrow as a view of what makes human life worthwhile. Happiness is a byproduct of our efforts to make ourselves the best person we can be, whether that's intellectually, whether that's musically, whether that's athletically, or whatever it is that we happen to view as the good for ourselves. Right? We sort of pursue that good by our reason and our long-term efforts, and our happiness is a kind of a byproduct of all the things that we do in these activities that extend us and allow us to flourish and extend our capacities. So it's not like we're pursuing self-interest, we're pursuing our own good, we're pursuing our own flourishing, and our happiness is a kind of byproduct of that. So anything which starts from self-interest, like Gyges' ring, which assumes you can get happiness by doing entirely self-interested things, has a completely wrong and completely too narrow view of what makes human life worthwhile, right? It's not just about being able to amass wealth and power. It's about flourishing as humans who have an idea of our good and are able to pursue it. So it's activities that allow us to exercise self-mastery and allow us to extend and develop our capacities, whether they be intellectual, musical, athletic, or whatever, are the key to self-fulfillment. And doing this requires our long-term focus and commitment. And of course, the long-term focus and commitment requires us to be ruled by reason and requires us to be ruled by an understanding, a rational understanding of our long-term good and our long-term interests. And it requires us to have the stability to make a commitment to that long-term good. So none of that is possible if we have a kind of short-term outlook on desire, or if desire is making the decisions. It's not going to allow us to develop our capacities and to exercise self-mastery. Okay, so we've seen how the story of Gyges' ring sets up this challenge for Socrates in the Republic, and we've looked at Gyges' ring as a sort of statement of Glaucon's position that people naturally pursue their self-interest. And so people will pursue their self-interest over other things and pursue that naturally. So we've seen Socrates distinguish our long-term good or our long-term well-being from our short-term desires. And as we saw, our short-term desires, that's the task of the part of the soul that Socrates calls desire. And there's another part of the soul that Socrates calls reason. And the task of reason is to look out for our long-term well-being. So we know that these things often will come into conflict. Our long-term well-being, say our long-term sort of well-being, our need for health, and so on, will clash sometimes with our short-term desires. Maybe we desire something which is not going to be good for our long-term well-being, and so we have to make decisions about what we give preference to. And it's reason's task to look out for our well-being in the longer term, to look out for the things that we value and that make up our sort of our general picture of the good, as opposed to things that happen to motivate us in the moment, which may be desires or strong emotions, and we have to sort of use reason to overcome those things. So reason's task is to look out for our long-term well-being, as is Socrates' solution to Gyges' ring. And we've seen how Glaucon uses the idea of Gyges' ring to put forward this theory about human nature, that humans are naturally self-interested. They're only concerned with others. They're only good if they're forced to be so. But their natural kind of tendency is to pursue their own self-interest.